Okay, so you want to own an anime studio. Rent a floor of a building somewhere in Nakano or Suganami, hire a room full of talented artists, and start turning out the next Demon Slayer or the next Attack on Titan. You already love the medium. You already know the fandom is enormous and only getting bigger every year, spreading from Japan into a genuinely global audience with real money behind it. All you have to do is make something good, and the money follows. Sounds simple. It is not simple. The Japanese animation industry as a whole is now estimated at roughly 3 trillion yen a year in total output, and that number keeps climbing as international streaming audiences grow. That's the headline everyone sees. What almost nobody sees is how that money is actually divided up once it starts flowing, and who's standing closest to the tap versus who's standing furthest away from it. Because almost nothing about how an anime studio actually makes money works the way a fan imagines it does. The studio that draws your favorite show is very often the poorest company touching that show's name. You're not really buying a creative powerhouse. You're buying a labor-intensive contracting business with razor-thin margins sitting inside an ownership structure that was designed decades ago to spread the financial risk as wide as possible while letting the real upside concentrate somewhere else entirely. Let's take it apart layer by layer. Start with what it actually costs to get in the door, because the range here is enormous, and the two ends of that range are barely the same industry. At the cheapest end, you can start a subcontracting studio in Japan with a small office, a handful of freelance in-between animators, and a modest amount of working capital, doing outsourced work for bigger studios one sequence at a time. You never touch the show's ownership. You never negotiate with a broadcaster. You get a package of scenes, you finish the frames somebody else already designed, and you get paid piecework for the delivery. That's how a huge share of Japan's animation companies actually operate day to day, not as the famous name in the opening credits, but as an anonymous link somewhere in a much longer supply chain. It's a low barrier to entry, and it comes with a correspondingly low ceiling. At the top end, building a full production studio with an in-house pipeline, key animators, in-between animators, background painters, colorists, digital compositors, directors, all on staff or on stable long-term contract, capable of carrying an entire 24-episode season without farming most of it out to subcontractors, is a completely different business. That takes real estate in an expensive city, dozens to hundreds of staff, expensive production and rendering software, and years of relationship building with the small handful of broadcasters, publishers, and toy companies who actually decide which projects get greenlit in the first place. The gap between those two tiers is the gap between a nameless subcontractor and a studio whose logo people recognize on sight. And almost every working studio in Japan sits somewhere on that spectrum, most of them sitting much closer to the subcontractor end than the household name end, no matter how the brand looks from the outside. That quality gap matters just as much as the price gap, because in an industry with a chronic shortage of experienced key animators, the studios at the top of the pyramid can be genuinely selective about which projects they take on, while studios lower down the pyramid often have to say yes to whatever work is offered just to keep the lights on and the freelance network paid. You're not just buying into a price tier when you choose which kind of studio to build. You're buying into a bargaining position, and that bargaining position is what determines almost everything that happens later. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Even if you build the expensive version, the one with the recognizable name and the in-house pipeline, you still might not own what you make. That's because of how ownership is actually structured in this industry, and it's structured almost nothing like a Hollywood film. In Hollywood, one studio typically finances a movie and owns everything that results from it. In Japan, most anime is financed and owned through something called a Seisaku Inkai, a production committee. A production committee is a consortium, usually somewhere between 4 and 15 or more companies, who each put up a slice of the budget and, in exchange, each walk away owning a slice of the resulting intellectual property, split by category. A single hit show can list well over a dozen companies on its production committee. A major shonen title, for instance, can easily have more than 15 separate names credited as committee members by the time it airs. The publisher who owns the original manga usually keeps the print and adaptation rights. The music label owns the soundtrack and any concert or streaming royalties tied to it. A toy manufacturer owns the merchandise category, the figures, the trading cards, the plush dolls. A publisher like Kadokawa might sit on the committee for the print rights. A music company like Aniplex, part of Sony, might sit there for the soundtrack and streaming exposure. and a toy giant like Bandai might sit there purely for the figure and card business. The broadcaster owns the original airtime and domestic ad revenue. Everybody who put money in gets a lane, and a proportional share of whatever profit eventually comes down that lane. In the animation studio, the company that actually draws the show, frame by frame, for a year or more of its existence. In the traditional version of this system, the studio is not a committee member at all. It's a contractor. It gets paid a flat production fee to deliver finished episodes, on schedule, to spec. And that's the end of its financial relationship to the project. If the show becomes a global phenomenon and generates hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise, streaming licenses, and theatrical spin-offs, the studio doesn't automatically see a cut of any of it, unless it specifically negotiated a seat at the committee table before production ever started. The biggest, most established studios increasingly do negotiate exactly that. Plenty of mid-tier and smaller studios still don't, because they don't have the leverage, the capital to invest alongside the committee, or simply the reputation yet to demand it. That single fact is the hidden cost nobody warns you about walking in. You can pour a year, sometimes two, of your studio's total labor into a runaway global hit, and still be paid exactly what you were paid for, a forgettable show nobody remembers a year later. The upside isn't stolen from you. It was simply never structured to be yours in the first place, because of an ownership agreement you signed before the first frame was ever drawn. And this isn't a fringe case. It's closer to the default arrangement across the industry, which is exactly why it counts as a hidden cost rather than an occasional bad break. You have to actively negotiate your way out of it, not into it. There are other hidden costs layered on top of that structural one. Studios frequently inherit a tangled web of freelance contracts, sometimes hundreds of individual animators, each paid per cut or per scene rather than salaried, which means the studio's total labor cost balloons unpredictably the moment a schedule slips, and slipping schedules are closer to the industry norm than the exception in this business. There's also real legal exposure around Japan's labor laws. The freelance piece rate structure that keeps a studio's fixed costs low on paper has drawn increasing regulatory attention over unpaid overtime and misclassified workers, and that scrutiny only gets louder as the industry's international profile grows. None of that shows up in the glossy pitch of own an anime studio. All of it shows up on the balance sheet by year 2. So how does the money actually flow once a show gets made? Picture it as several distinct layers, stacked one on top of the other, each one owned by a different member of the committee. Layer 1 is the production fee itself, what the committee pays the studio to make the show, negotiated up front, largely fixed regardless of how the finished product performs. Layer 2 is broadcast revenue, what the television network pays for the original airtime and the advertising sold around it, which the broadcaster on the committee typically captures. Layer 3 is home video and streaming licensing, Blu-ray and DVD sales in Japan, plus licensing fees paid by platforms like Crunchyroll or Netflix for international streaming rights, split among committee members according to their category. Layer 4 is merchandise, toys, apparel, video games, food and drink collaborations, tie-ins with convenience store chains and clothing brands, and this layer is frequently the single largest revenue stream of all, almost always owned by whichever toy or licensing company happened to sit on the committee, not by the studio that designed the characters in the first place. Here's a real, concrete way to see the scale of that merchandise layer. Demon Slayer, one of the biggest anime franchises of the last decade, didn't just sell manga volumes and streaming subscriptions. Its footprint spread into clothing collaborations with the retailer Uniqlo, promotional tie-ins with the convenience store chain Lawson, themed cafes, mobile games, and branded train campaigns across Japan. By 2023, the cumulative economic impact attributed to the franchise across all of those categories had surpassed 1 trillion yen. Read that again, over 1 trillion yen, roughly $7 billion at the time, flowing through a web of publishers, toy companies, retail partners, and streaming platforms. The animation studio that actually drew Demon Slayer is a real, respected, talented company. It is not the company that captured the largest share of that trillion yen. That's the counterintuitive detail that reframes this entire business. The studio makes the product that everyone falls in love with, and is very often the smallest financial beneficiary of that love, sitting at the bottom of a revenue stack it doesn't control. Now flip to the other side of the ledger, because the expense side of an anime studio is brutal, and it's brutal in a specific structural way that traces directly back to who's paying for what. Labor is the dominant cost, and labor in this industry has historically been shockingly cheap for the people actually doing it, even as that same labor adds up into a serious line item for the studio footing hundreds of episodes worth of bills a year. A landmark 2009 industry white paper, published by the Japan Animation Creators Association or JANICA, found that doga animators, the entry-level artists who draw the in-between frames connecting one key pose to the next, earned an average of just 1.1 million yen a year, something like $10,000, for work that regularly ran past 10 hours a day. That number has since improved substantially. JANICA's 2023 survey found doga staff averaging 2.63 million yen annually, with Genga staff, the more senior key animators who actually draw the defining poses, averaging close to 4 million yen, and the industry as a whole finally approaching the average income of Japan's private sector overall. But even at those improved figures, a large share of an anime's actual hands-on creative labor is still paid at rates that make retaining experienced staff a constant struggle, and a constant recurring cost for whichever studio is trying to hold on to them. On top of wages, you're carrying office rent in an expensive part of Tokyo, workstations and rendering hardware, insurance, and the overtime that comes from a broadcast schedule that simply does not move. An episode airs on its scheduled date whether or not the animation is actually finished, so the studio absorbs the cost of getting it done regardless of how smoothly the production actually went behind the scenes. Most of that entry-level labor, remember, isn't salaried at all. It's paid per cut, meaning an animator is paid a set amount for each individual piece of animation they complete, not for the hours it takes to complete it. That pay structure keeps a studio's fixed cost down on a normal week. But it also means that when a schedule tightens and a studio needs more cuts finished faster, the only lever available is asking already stretched freelancers to work longer hours for the same per-cut rate, rather than simply paying overtime the way a salaried position would. The system that keeps costs predictable in a good year is the same system that makes a bad year fall hardest on the people with the least power to say no. And here's the trap. The metric that looks the healthiest on the surface in this industry, the sheer number of simultaneous shows a studio has in production, is often exactly the number that should worry you most. A studio juggling 6 or 8 shows at once looks, from the outside, like a thriving in-demand company that everyone wants to work with. In practice, it frequently means the studio has spread its experienced staff so thin across so many productions at once that quality slips on all of them, freelancers get double and triple booked between competing deadlines, schedules cascade into each other, and margins on every single show shrink simultaneously. Busy is not the same as healthy in this business. It just looks that way from the outside, right up until it very suddenly doesn't. To understand why the whole industry is built this way in the first place, you have to go back to January 1963 and to Osamu Tezuka, the manga artist behind Astro Boy, a man so influential in Japan he's still referred to today as the god of manga. When Tezuka's own company, Mushi Production, sold Astro Boy to the broadcaster Fuji TV as Japan's first weekly animated television series, he priced the deal at around 500,000 yen per episode. The real cost of producing each episode, using the animation techniques available at the time, ran closer to 2.5 million yen. On paper, Tezuka was selling every single episode at a steep loss, but he wasn't trying to make his money on the broadcast fee at all. Mushi Production kept the merchandising and licensing rights to the character, and Tezuka made his real money selling Astro Boy toys, books, and brand endorsements built on the show's growing popularity. The broadcast itself was the loss leader. The character was the actual product being sold. It's worth noting that historians of the industry have since pushed back on exactly how much blame belongs to Tezuka personally for what came after. Some point out that other early studios of the era set similarly aggressive, low broadcast rates on their own, and that the common knowledge version of this story was popularized years later by a rival animator with his own grievances against Tezuka. But the underlying business decision is not in dispute, and it's the decision that matters here. Sell the show itself cheap, and recoup the real money somewhere else entirely. That became the founding logic the entire modern industry still runs on today. It's the direct ancestor of the production committee system. Distribute the low-margin broadcast risk onto a network, and let the real profit accumulate in licensing, merchandise, and adjacent revenue streams owned by whoever controls those specific rights. The only thing that's changed since 1963 is how many separate companies now split that adjacent revenue between themselves, and how rarely the animation studio itself is one of them. That same design logic is also the industry's biggest structural risk, because a system built around thin, fixed production fees, and a rotating cast of freelance labor has almost no slack built into it anywhere. When a studio takes on more simultaneous productions than its actual in-house staff and reliable freelance network can realistically support, which the production fee model constantly tempts a studio to do, since every additional show in production means more fee revenue arriving right now, the whole thing can come apart very quickly. Schedules slip, freelancers get spread across too many overlapping productions to deliver consistent quality, and a studio that looked busy and successful 18 months earlier can find itself financially exposed almost overnight. This isn't a hypothetical scenario, it's exactly what happened to one of the industry's most aggressive studios of the 2000s. That studio was Gonzo, styled as Gonzo, founded in September 1992 by Shoji Murahama, a producer who had previously worked at the influential studio Gainax alongside other Gainax alumni. Gonzo built a strong reputation through the 1990s and early 2000s for ambitious, visually distinctive science fiction and action titles. Shows like Full Metal Panic and Last Exile, and its parent holding company, GDH, went public on the Tokyo Stock Exchange's Mothers section, the exchange's market specifically designed for high-growth emerging companies. For a while, the aggressive growth strategy genuinely worked. Gonzo built a name for original, big-swing productions rather than just safe manga adaptations. But by 2007 and 2008, Gonzo was pushing out as many as 8 of its own in-house productions in a single year, an extraordinary pace for a studio of its size, betting that sheer volume of output would outrun the risk of any individual show underperforming. It didn't. In the fiscal year ending March 2008, GDH reported a net loss of 3.752 billion yen, roughly $35 million, on revenue of 6.853 billion yen, about $64 million. The company's total liabilities had grown to exceed its total assets. In July 2008, the Tokyo Stock Exchange issued a formal one-year monitoring notice, warning that continued financial deterioration could lead to delisting if the company couldn't turn things around. Gonzo restructured hard over the following year, closing several of its internal studio divisions, selling off subsidiaries, and betting on early streaming and simultaneous broadcast deals to bring in fresh cash. But the recovery never arrived in time. A couple of the shows Gonzo produced during this stretch, including Strike Witches and Saki, actually found real audiences and real success. But even genuine hits weren't enough to offset losses spread across the rest of an 8-show slate. On July 30, 2009, Gonzo was formally delisted from the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Its parent company absorbed what remained of the studio to consolidate what was left of the business. The studio survived. Technically, it still exists today, largely doing subcontracting work rather than the ambitious original productions that built its name in the first place. But the company that once looked like one of the most productive in-demand studios in the entire industry had been financially hollowed out by the exact same growth strategy that made it look so successful only a couple of years earlier. Gonzo's collapse happened before the industry's next major transformation, and that transformation is streaming. Starting around 2018, platforms like Netflix began investing directly in anime production, in some cases financing shows outright, rather than joining a traditional production committee at all, and paying studios and creators for global distribution rights in a single deal, instead of the old country-by-country, window-by-window licensing chain that used to take years to fully play out. For some studios, that shift has meant real leverage they simply didn't have before, a direct check from a platform with deep pockets, immediate global reach, without needing a dozen separate international distributors, and in some cases, actual ownership stakes or profit participation that the old committee structure almost never offered the people actually drawing the show. It's also changed the negotiating table itself. A studio that used to have to wait for a publisher and a toy company to agree on financing terms can now, in some cases, go straight to a platform with a pitch and come back with a production budget already secured, collapsing a process that used to take many months of committee building into a single deal. The studios that have adapted best to this shift are the ones that stopped treating a flat production fee as the entire business model. They've pushed to sit on production committees as investors rather than just contract for them as vendors, diversified into developing and owning original intellectual property outright instead of only adapting someone else's manga, and used the leverage of being one of a genuinely small number of studios capable of delivering consistent, high-quality work on schedule to negotiate meaningfully better terms than the flat-fee model that's dominated this industry since Tezuka's era. The studios that haven't adapted are, in effect, still running the exact same playbook Gonzo ran back in 2007, say yes to nearly every project that comes in the door, hope that volume alone covers the gap, and hope nothing slips. So picture the two futures actually in front of you if you did this. In the optimistic scenario, you land a genuine global hit. You negotiated your way onto the production committee before the cameras ever rolled. Instead of trying to after the fact, streaming platforms are competing to bid for your international rights. And the merchandise layer. The layer Tezuka figured out how to capture back in 1963, and that most studios since have simply let pass them by, actually flows back into your business instead of past it. That's a real, durable, compounding business. The kind that can fund its next several productions out of the last one's success. In the realistic bad year scenario, you're running 4 overlapping shows at once just to keep the production fees coming in the door. Your freelance animators are stretched across all 4 simultaneously. One schedule slips and drags the other 3 down with it. Your studio is a contractor with no equity stake whatsoever in the one property that actually took off, and 18 months from now you're the cautionary case study in someone else's video essay. The unsettling part is that both of those futures can look identical from the outside for most of the ride. A full slate of announced titles, a busy studio, a recognizable name in the credits. The difference only becomes visible on the balance sheet. And by the time it does, it's usually too late to renegotiate your way onto the committee you should have joined at the start. You're not really buying a studio that gets to keep the character everyone falls in love with. You're buying a factory that gets paid once to draw that character into existence, and then watches everyone else on the committee decide what it's actually worth. This video is for educational purposes and explores how this industry has historically worked. It is not financial or investment advice.